Welcome everybody. This is Steve Wilson from the State Water Survey, and today's webinar is on outreach strategies for working with private well owners. This is the first time we've done this webinar as one of our monthly hour-long or 2-hour-long webinars. If anyone has taken our 4-hour workshop on outreach and our assessment tool, some of this material comes from that. It's not exactly the same, but yeah, welcome. And I want to mention that we're at the Illinois State Water Survey at the University of Illinois, and that this program, the private well class, is a partnership with RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and with funding from US EPA. So thanks for joining us. Again, this is part of a national program. RCAP has 6 regions, which I'll get to in a second, and they're kind of the boots on the ground side of the program, and we're the online side of the program. Everything's based on our 10-lesson class, the private well class. And so these webinars typically support those lessons. This one's a little different in that it's really geared towards professionals, and it's meant to, it doesn't cover material directly in the lessons, but it covers material from work that we've done and research that we've done related to outreach to private well owners, as well as our experiences. So at the end, there'll be time for follow-up questions. A number of you asked questions in advance when you signed up for this webinar. The ones of those that we've answered will show up as a slide at the end. But feel free, if you have other questions or questions that come up during the presentation today, to put those in the question or chat box. Katie Buckley, who's also on the call, will be monitoring that, and she's making a list of those questions. So at the very end, once the slides are done, we'll pull those questions up on the screen, and we'll try to go through them. And we'll stay and answer questions as long as you're willing to stick around. And I do want to mention National Environmental Health Association is also a partner on this grant. They actually provide our 10-lesson class through their e-learning platform, and each of the 10 lessons are worth 1 CE for environmental health professionals who can use NEHA credit for their credentialing. And so, yeah, they've been a very supportive partner over the years. As far as NEHA guidelines, normally, a lot of the webinars we do every month are a repeat from 5 or 6 months ago, because we always have new well owners signing up for our class. And so our primary mission is to reach well owners all over the country, although working with you all allows us to, hopefully you're a cheerleader for us and are giving information about the private well class to the well owners that you work with. And so that's kind of the idea here. But this is the first time this webinar has been offered, so we have no issues about the 2-year credentialing cycle or any of that stuff. But as far as today goes, if you email us at info@privatewellclass.org, we can provide, at your request, a certificate of attendance, the completed NEHA forms, and a copy of the slide deck. Also, we are in Illinois at the University of Illinois, and so we are an accredited LEHP provider in Illinois. Currently, no other states. That's because we don't have the bandwidth. We wish we could, and we've looked into that a little bit, but it's to become a certified provider in some states is really cumbersome, and we just do not have the ability or the staff to do that. I mentioned RCAP. If you're not familiar, you might know them by one of the regional affiliates names. So RCAP is a true partnership. It's of 6 nonprofits. RCAP Solutions in the Northeast. We're in Illinois, so we're under the Great Lakes Community Action Partnership. And in each of those regions, those folks, there's one private well lead, and there's generally 2 or 3 other additional staff who work on private well issues through our private well grant with US EPA. And so they put on workshops, they do well assessments, which I'll explain down the road here. Excuse me. But they're available to you as a professional. If you want to put on a workshop, they'd be glad to partner with you. If you need them to come speak at a workshop, especially the leads are all experts in private well issues. They've done many one-on-one visits with well owners to help them solve their issues. Yeah, it's actually a really good setup in that we have about 17 staff at RCAP total working on private well issues, as well as all the partners, which include, I mentioned NEHA, also the National Groundwater Association, and the Texas Well Owner Network, to name three. And so, yeah, if you need to reach any of those folks or are interested in learning more about RCAP's program, you can email us, or you can look these folks up online. Each has a website. And the national office, rcap.org, they have a private well page that lists a lot of information about the regions and the work that's been done. So we're at the Illinois State Water Survey, and it's actually a wonderful place to work. We've been around for 128 years. It was started, it's really a sister agency to a state geological survey. It's just that Illinois has a separate water survey that deals with groundwater, surface water, atmospheric sciences, and chemistry. And it was started because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks, basically. And so we have a long history. We not only serve the public in Illinois and help communities with water issues, quantity and quality, but we also house the state's well logs. We monitor all the water use in the state from high capacity wells. And we have a lab that has a database of over 30,000 groundwater samples that allow us to really understand what's going on with our aquifers in the state. Like, we know which aquifers have arsenic, or where there's small areas where there might be really high fluoride naturally occurring, things like that. And so we're able to do applied research here, which I've been very fortunate to get to do. And so, yeah, it's just a neat place. And speaking to our history, I mentioned we were started because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks. So there's a lot of information like this in our records. And I pulled these out off of glass plate slides that date back to 1900. And so you can see the advent of treatment for water systems really put a dent in some of the water quality problems, and especially things like typhoid. And so there's many of these kind of diagrams and pictures and tables about all that stuff. We used to sample all the community wells. Most communities had a hand pump in a park, just like this one. Those were eventually outlawed. You can see the little silver cup there, just off the edge of the pump, and everybody came up and took a drink when they wanted a drink, and no one thought anything of it. And now we know that drop pipe, as well as that hand pump, because it's exposed to air, is likely full of biofilms and a number of different kinds of bacteria. So we're here today to talk about outreach challenges, or outreach in general, and strategies. So first off, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges we have. And really, it comes down to, and there are a number of questions about this, there always are, about is the lack of funding for private well programs, especially outreach programs. And it comes down to, unless you have a champion or someone who's going to fund a project specifically, because wells aren't regulated after they're drilled and installed and approved initially, they take a back seat a lot of times at a local health district or even at a state agency to other things that are regulated or that have mandates, like septic inspections or food inspections or all the other things EHPs have to do as part of their job. And so, because it's not a priority, a lot of times there isn't funding or time or enough staff to do those kinds of programs. This is starting to change. We see, CDC has developed quite a robust private well program. They fund, the last funding they did, I can't remember if that was 2 or 3 years ago, was 19 state health departments and 5 county or local health departments or districts. And with that funding, it's 5 years of funding to basically improve their private well program in their area. I know one of the first recipients of that money, probably 10 years ago now, was Madison County, New York. And you can look on their website and see all the information they learned by sampling wells in Madison County. They could correlate things like 60% of all the coliform bacteria hits, or more than that. I can't remember. Of all the coliform hits, like 80% were where a well cap wasn't properly sealed or it didn't have a well cap at all. I mean, all those kinds of resources. So if you have someone who can write a grant, the CDC program is probably your best bet as far as possible funding. Some state agencies like Iowa, they provide, I won't say agency, the state legislature in Iowa provides funding to their counties. It's called the Grants to Counties program, where they can use those funds to help cost share well abandonment or sampling costs, things like that. But in general, there just isn't a lot out there. And as far as other challenges we have, differences in construction and codes, rules, I mean. And so between states, there's a lot of variety. And even within states where you have home rule, like I'll use Massachusetts as an example, there are 354 local health districts in Massachusetts. I think that's the right number, it's close to that. And in each one, they can set their own rules or decide not to have rules. And so someone living in Massachusetts could literally move across the street and go from having no rules to having to sample their well, and the health district could condemn the well if they found that it was contaminated and couldn't be remediated. And so that's really a problem with how we deal with well owners. Not having that consistency, not having kind of a playbook to use that can be consistent across jurisdictions makes it hard for us to give advice sometimes. And so, even with permitting and well log submittal, Mississippi, you're not required to submit a log if it's unless it's if it's under 5 inches, I believe, in diameter. And so there's entire counties, close to, if there's hardly any, or if any, well logs submitted in some counties there. And I put New Jersey versus Pennsylvania to show two extremes. New Jersey is the first state to pass a law that requires testing of wells at home sale. So any property that sells with a well has to be tested. The buyer and the seller have to agree up front who's going to pay it. The state lab does the analysis, or they used to. I think now they farm that out. But it's for a list of, it's over 40 constituents. And only the buyer and seller get the information in the end. It's not made public. They publish maps that are on 2-mile grids so that no individual home can be discerned from that. But because of that, they've done this for over 15 years. And at least the last time I heard someone from New Jersey speak on this, they get about 13,000, research quality samples every year because of that program. And so now they have a database with hundreds of thousands of data points where they understand very well the water quality of their aquifers and where hot spots might be, or where there's certain contaminants that show up more prevalently. On the other side, we have Pennsylvania, which is one of 2 states that still have no construction code, and they don't license drillers. And so what's happened in Pennsylvania is, Pennsylvania's extension at Penn State has developed into a really robust, one of the best programs in the country probably, for working with well owners and educating well owners. They have a train the trainer program that's really popular. They do a lot of research related to wells and issues related to wells, even in a lot of local stakeholder groups. I know the League of Women Voters in Pennsylvania has been really active in even providing funding for small research studies related to wells, because it's a huge issue, and because the Pennsylvania legislature hasn't stepped up, others nearby have. So, and because of those things, enforcement really varies. In some states, you may have rules, but they're not enforceable, and so no one follows them, some of those sorts of things. But the bottom line is, these differences really make it difficult to provide consistency when you're working with well owners. Sorry. And it makes it tough for us. We work nationally. So what we try to do is be consistent and provide resources that can be used everywhere. And so even like when we make a recommendation for what things should be sampled for, we don't just say sample for these things. We say, here are the basic things that everyone should sample for, but you should also contact your state health department or your local health district and any other agency that works with water quality in your state, groundwater quality, and find out what issues might be in your area and make sure and sample for that. And so, the poster child for that argument is Rhode Island, where they have about a third of the state has high beryllium in their groundwater. And until I saw that on their website, I didn't even realize beryllium was a regulated contaminant. But it is, it just doesn't occur in a lot of places. So, I wouldn't recommend everyone sample for beryllium, but I sure would if you were in that area of Rhode Island. So it's about the right kind of advice so that you're consistent and and so that people realize that you're looking at their specific needs. There's also not a lot of training for environmental health professionals related to private wells. So, and I really believe that's one reason why the private well class has become popular. We meet a need. Now we offer CEs, which and there's no cost, so that's certainly popular. But the first year we started the private well class, in our evaluation, we had 700 or 800 people take it the first year, and 22% were environmental health professionals, and they all said one of two things: why wasn't this available when I started my job? So people are inspecting wells and they've not had any formal training on how to do that. And how do I get credit for this? Which is how NEHA got in the picture in our program in the first place. So it's also because there's so many other programs that health departments have to deal with related to either enforcement issues or legislative mandates, or things that are as critical or even more critical, such as food inspections at restaurants and things like that. So again, these have led to mostly local approaches to support for well owners. If someone in their office really, it maybe is a private well owner themselves, and they want to champion that issue, they're the person who builds that program, maybe even writes a proposal and gets a grant funded. But then when that grant ends or when they leave, there's no one to step up if they haven't, created a legacy program, so to speak, to keep that moving forward. And so without that consistent funding and without having someone ready to step in line, it's difficult to stay active and relevant. And we see that a lot, a community or a health department may get a grant for a few years, and then maybe they've learned what they need to learn, but that doesn't help the well owners in that jurisdiction when they call 5 years later and there's no one to talk to when they have a problem. And so it's part of that consistency is really a challenge. So for today's webinar, I think this is a really important webinar to do. We should have been doing this a long time ago, is because, private well owners are solely responsible for their well and their drinking water quality. And a lot of them aren't prepared or knowledgeable about their well or their water quality or groundwater issues, or even basic information like how deep my well is, where my water's coming from, all those things. And so they call, and one of the first places they call is a health department or a lab. And so it's upon us to really be aware and have the right information to motivate them when they do call, as well as reach out to those that don't seem to care or don't understand what those risks are. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. And so most don't ever test their well. I know 10 or 15 years ago, the number was 2/3 of well owners were assumed not to test their water. I don't know that there's been any work done to really look at that since then. I think there's been a lot of strides in the last 10 years, not only obviously our program, but if you look at the research, there used to be so few papers related to groundwater and private wells that you always had to look elsewhere to find information on a given topic, like how to do outreach. And I want to talk about that in a little bit. But nowadays, there's a ton of people doing research related to private wells, and it's great. It's bringing more attention to them. We're seeing federal agencies take an interest. The amount of money available from EPA is less than, it was about 1/10, even 7 years ago than it is today for private well outreach and education, which is what they fund us to do. So it's becoming a better thing, but it's still not where it needs to be with 23 million private wells. That's almost 60 million people in the country that have a private well. So yeah, our job is to potentially facilitate change in well owner attitudes and well stewardship, and not only testing, but even understanding how their well works, what they need to check annually, what they need to be aware of as far as around their well, all those basic things to help keep them and their family safe. So today we did a study funded by CDC. Started in I think 2013 on why well owners don't test, and our plan was to reach out to 100 programs and do a survey of that have actually done outreach and education to well owners. And so in the end, we identified 91 programs that responded and worked with us, and there were some delays in the middle of that project. And so another thing that we did as part of it was we reviewed all the literature regarding behavior change and risk communication. And so today, everything or most of the stuff we're going to talk about is based on those two sets of data, as well as our own experience. And we actually have a lot of experience. Again, we've been around for over 100 years. We get requests regularly from well owners in Illinois and now around the country. We do a lot of research related to groundwater, where we are working with well owners to sample their well or measure water levels in their well and things like that. So, and why all that matters, those are the two main reasons: source water protection of our aquifers and public health protection for the folks drinking the water coming from their well, and helping them understand why that's so important and some of the issues behind it. So I guess I mentioned this already, the survey of 91 outreach programs. We reviewed the public health communication literature, and I also sent one of my staff to some of the well owner programs that do workshops, and they sat in and hung out with them for a couple weeks to see what they do and how they do their outreach to well owners, just to give us some more ideas and understand. I went to Texas, Rhode Island, and I believe Virginia, all extension through their well owner networks. And then again, we house all the state's private well logs. We do well designs for communities. We have a lab that's got over 30,000 samples from our wells. And so we do applied research, and that also helps us understand what's going on. And a number of our folks are actually private well owners themselves. So, and then we work with a lot of other professionals, drillers, educators, and you learn a lot from every time you get a chance to work with somebody else with any private well experience. And I'll go back to Penn State. He's retired now, but Brian Swistock was the lead of that program for a number of years, over 20 years, I believe. And I've learned more from him than from probably any other person about wells. He really walked the walk. So I was really fortunate to be able to spend some time with him. Okay, so our literature review, it really had three areas of focus: looking for behavior change barriers, why people don't do whatever, and motivations to get them to change, and then looking at risk communication best practices. So we looked at nearly 400 research papers, and I'll show you a list of those, a few of those in a minute. But we do have all of the ones that we used in a list, and I'll show you all of that, and we'll make that available to you today. But we looked at behavior change and risk communication in general, not just related to private wells or drinking water, but everything. Rural areas, smoking, teen pregnancy, arthritis, I mean, you name it, where someone had done a communications type or intervention type research project that was related to the public. We tried to use what worked for them and what they found motivated folks the best, and made that part of some of the work that we put together. And again, that's partly because we realized there just weren't a lot of good papers and good research out there on just working with private well owners. There were a few, but not a lot. Now there's a lot more today. So this is the first 14 papers that are part of the ones we used to write a paper I'm going to show you in a second that we published. But you can see here, There's number 4 is health communications in rural America, lessons learned from an arthritis campaign. Number 6 is about health interventions on the internet, realizing their potential. So it was really targeting ways of communicating and what barriers people found and how they motivated folks to actually voluntarily or willingly, when it's not mandated, take action, and what worked and what didn't work and why. And so this list is, I think, like 139 or so, or somewhere around there. I can't remember the number today, but it's been a while. But it's all the actual published research papers that we use to develop this paper, which is really the basis for what we're going to talk about today. Methods for conducting effective outreach to private well owners. I'm more of an applied scientist type of guy. I don't write very many research papers. I'd rather write a report that's publicly available. And this is one of the few, I think this is one of 2 I've written since 2016 or 2015. But this was important because of all the work that one of my staff did, Lucinda Morris, who's a lead author here, in putting all that information together. We came up with an approach, and it's really a good approach. It's really effective, and especially for folks who are trying to start a program of outreach to well owners. And so it's based on, I'll show you in a second, 2 things. But I want to talk about the other side of this was the survey we did, and we were looking to, the idea was to really pick the brain of people who've already done the work, who have experience, who have been either who are successful or who have funding to do outreach to well owners, and find out if they were successful and why, what they learned, what they do differently, and what they would tell someone who's starting from scratch. And so the idea was we wanted to put all that together in the survey results, so that folks would, it might help with the rest of us, as we get into these types of programs. And again, I mentioned already, the goal is 100 programs, looking to gather information on implementation, methods, results, and logistics. And we ended up in 91. And part of that was, there was probably another 100 we could have used, but they were all identical. They all offered free testing for, and it's a county health department that did this for 2 weeks. Or did it during Groundwater Awareness Week every March. And so we stuck with the 91 not to skew anything. And, the plan was originally to do this by phone and take a statistical look at things like how many staff they had, how many people they helped, all those sorts of things. In the end, it's a federal funded project, and they didn't allow us to use the phone. We had to do this as a online survey, and that really limited what we could do, and we weren't even allowed to contact people and talk to them unless we had a problem. And so, trying to get at how they were funded and some of the other things that we hoped to look at didn't happen. But what we did do is get a lot of responses from all these program leaders regarding their experiences and what they learned and best practices. They self-evaluated the success of their program, and we use that as the metric to hold them up against. And I'll show some of that when we get to some of the other results. But it worked out, especially because we have data from these 91 programs, and some of them wrote really extensive information for us to use on why they, or what they do differently, what they learned. And so that's all available to all of us, including you today. So this is really the meat of what we came up with, and it's an approach to reaching out to well owners and long-term becoming a trusted person that you have a lot more success. Well owners can be distrusting, all those issues. So it's really 5 steps. The first is understand your audience. You need to understand, I'll go through these, we're going to go through these one by one. Then identify the barriers or why they haven't tested or done any kind of, whatever you're trying to get out of them as far as testing or providing information about their well, or, in one case, the study was trying to locate every well and actually give it a GPS coordinate. So they're not all testing programs. And then once you know what the barriers are, selecting the right motivations to change their attitude towards that. And then once you've done that and they're interested, why partnerships are important, And the more work, many hands make light work is a really great saying. And then once you've started your program and got it moving along, if you're consistent and you do right by the folks you're working with, you can build a trusting relationship that makes things, makes things that much better and easier for you. And you're considered a resource, you're trustworthy, all those things. So as far as understand your audience, that's the first step we're going to talk about today. The issue is that it isn't one size fits all. You can't say, well owners here's a problem. They come from every demographic, every income level, some urban or rural, every education level. Some have past experiences that have skewed their view of the world, or something's happened in their area, like even, a large animal facility, the lagoon broke. And if they're part of that, they obviously have a skewed view because of what happened, and rightly so. So their past experiences, how long they've been on a farm, if there's known contamination in the area. We have areas where, like I mentioned, beryllium in Rhode Island. Well, there's areas where it's known where there's high arsenic or other naturally occurring contaminants. You have to deal with younger folks versus older folks differently, and many times you have both in a given area, and so you've got to approach them differently, and also how much information they've had exposure to. Are they, some folks are active online, some just read the paper and watch the news. And how do you deal with those differences and some of the things that they might be learning. And so again, you need to understand your audience. They come from every social, economic, and education class. I grew up on a farm on an old dug well, and I'll bring that up in a minute. I'm sure I have a picture of that. But some have been there for their whole life. So was their dad, so was their grandfather. We lived on my grandfather's homestead farm, and and others, they come from the city. We had a professor here at the U of I in finance who came from New York City, had never been on a well, bought a house in the country. 3 months after living there, their well, they had a problem. He called us and asked us what to do. He'd never thought anything of, just you turn on your tap, you have water his whole life. And now he didn't. So, everyone's experiences are different. And again, it could be a rural area like I grew up in, or a completely urban setting like Cook County. And, it's a great example because if you're not familiar with the Chicago metro area, Cook County is the innermost county where Chicago proper is. And so there's 6 surrounding collar counties that are all considered completely urban, other than, you have golf courses, you have some forest preserves, things like that. But when I tell people, even in Illinois, that there are 3,000 private wells in Cook County, they look at me like a deer in headlights. No way, it's all urban. Well, a lot of those municipal boundaries don't match up. And, in the 70s or before, when that was all happening, people would put subdivisions in, they put in septic and wells. And so you have these clusters like the blue dots that are shown here of wells that are in a completely urban area that are all still in use today. Matter of fact, the one we've highlighted here, it's a 140-foot limestone well. And this is from our State Geological Survey, has a tool online where you can look at all the well logs in the state. This was put in 1995, so it's not that old compared to, Chicago's this area's been urbanized for over 100 years. And their issues are things like road salt or industry, worried about, there was a big TCE plume up in the Chicago metro area about 20 years ago, and it contaminated several hundred wells because there happened to be one of these areas just south of that plant. Well density, so you have several subdivisions with wells right on top of each other. They all have septic systems as well because they don't have community services because they're not part of a community. And then well density becomes a problem. And so things like spills, and we've we've collected data to show how road salts affected the shallow aquifers up there. There's some of the communities that use the shallow aquifers that are going to not be able to use it, or going to have to treat it because road salt's becoming such a problem. So folks in an area like the Chicago metro region have much different issues than like where I grew up. So that blue circle on the far right is about where my well was. And I grew up about 1.5 miles outside of Middletown, Illinois. My grandpa hand dug our well in 1933. It was only 14 feet deep. It was uncemented brick. It was in a ravine such that it could collect more water. It was also in a pasture where we had sheep and cattle. And so all that water ran right to the well. If in the summer, if it was dry, we could run out of water, or if, true story, if I left a hose on in our horse tank or cattle tank, we might be without water for 2 or 3 days. In the winter, we could lose power. When I was in 1976, there was an ice storm. We were without power for 7 days, and electric pump doesn't work without electricity. And so, and within a mile, there's I said 3 wells nearby. There's actually 5. It looks like. But there's very few wells in the area to compete with or to worry about, or septic systems or any of those things. But then again, we had livestock. And the funny part is, I never heard any stories growing up about our well being a problem. My dad actually always swore it was better than city water because we don't put chemicals in our water, and the city does, and chemicals are bad. And so, it's a total lack of understanding. I drank water with bacteria in it my whole life. So when I came to the U of I and was on city water for 3 or 4 months, when I went back home and drank our water, I got sick because the bacteria that I had built up in my system were gone. And it's just something that people don't realize. They think it's fine because they've been drinking it their whole life. It's just not the case. So the other thing that's an issue is media drives a boat a lot of times. Think of Flint, Michigan and lead. When there's a drought or there's flooding, some of those things are getting worse, especially the flooding side. And so there's been a lot of work done in Florida and Texas, looking at private wells, and Louisiana as well, after floods and all the contamination issues like that. But when these things happen, they can also be opportunities. After Flint, Michigan happened, we got a lot of calls from folks worried about lead, and it's really an issue because it has nothing to do with the groundwater. It's not an aquifer problem, it's a pipe problem, and that affects community water supplies and public and private water supplies really the same. And so it's really a concern. And I put on your public notice, going back to the fact that some well owners really haven't done their due diligence to understand and become knowledgeable about the basics of their well. When a community puts a public notice out for a boil order, it's usually because of a main break. So whenever they lose pressure in a water main, they have to, until they can fix that and prove and be sure that there's no contamination, nothing got in to the system from outside, they have to issue a boil order. Typically there's enough pressure that doesn't happen in the lines. But when a boil order notice goes out, we have water operators tell us that they get calls from private well owners wondering if their well's in danger. And it has nothing to do with their well or the aquifer or any of those things. And so it's just another point I'd like to make about, remember, and when you're working with well owners, some may have plenty of wherewithal. In Illinois, you're actually allowed to drill your own well if it's for yourself and on your own property. You just can't do it for anybody else unless you're licensed. I don't know that that's actually a good rule, but it's the way it is. And so some folks do have the wherewithal to do that. So, and the other thing I wanted to mention is we did ask them about the 91 participants about if local issues had any effect on participation. And out of the 91, 48 gave us a local issue that was a problem in their area and affected the way well owners viewed their program. And so it really does make a difference when these things happen, or if there's a known issue. it may be a good place to start, is even one thing I wanted to say. Because if there's a large animal feeding operation going in an area, everyone gets in an uproar, it's a perfect time to try to either get funding or to start a campaign with all the local well owners in the area about, have you tested your well? With fracking, the recommendation was always you should sample your well before fracking starts so that you have a baseline of information in case fracking affects your well. And I mean, that's not only good advice, but it's also a way to get more people, not only, because what testing does, not only the testing lets you know if your well's safe or not, or if your water's safe or not, but it also gets you more engaged and leads to people asking more questions and better questions. And so it just kind of spills over itself once you can get things started. But yeah, it's a lot of times that's one way to engage folks, is if there's a local issue that's going on. And so the other point of that, though, is you may have in mind what you want to do with your outreach program, and you're going to go this direction. But if you take the time to understand what's important to your well owners in your area and what's going to be the best way to engage them, you may have to slightly change or even dramatically change the direction you were going to go. Because if you can figure out what motivates them, you're much more likely to get them involved. And in the long run, maybe you don't get exactly what you wanted out of it the first time, but if everything else goes well and you've done your job and they understand and you're transparent, all those things, you've made some allies with those well owners who not only will be willing to participate in the future, but they also will tell their neighbors and friends. And that's kind of the way it works. And so it's really important to meet their needs first, and that gives you an opportunity to be accepted. And from there, you can get more into some of the things that you might be interested in, either for research purpose or even just for understanding your groundwater in your area purpose as you work with the well owners there. So as far as identifying barriers, yeah, it's really the hitch, right? We wonder why 2/3 haven't sampled. There's a lot of reasons. What we've done is kind of broke them down into 4. So this is also in this paper, and they come down to knowledge barriers, risk perception barriers, barriers of inconvenience, and personal or social barriers, and really in that order. So the questions to ask are on the left here. Are they aware of the risk? Do they even understand? Because that's where we can educate them the most and correct misconceptions. And once we make them aware of those things, then do they understand that it's a threat, or do they feel threatened? And if they don't, then give them examples of how it is a risk, or what you've learned, or what's going on in an area near you. I know. So there's some work being done in Massachusetts right now. Well, most of the Northeast is very similar in its geology and groundwater quality. And so if you can use results from Massachusetts and you're in another state nearby, that's still valuable information to share. We're at the same type of aquifer, we have the same naturally occurring contaminants. It's very likely that we're going to have the same type of results. And so, it's a risk, and here's why, and here's the health effects, and, all those things. And once you get past that, that really gets a lot to many well owners, but then there may be other issues. We've had people tell us, well, I can only drop off a sample after 5 and they're not open, or, some of those type of things. Well, in that particular example, for instance, there's a lab that you can work with online. Well, they'll ship the samples directly to the well owner, and the well owner can ship them straight to the lab. So it's more convenient, finding ways to do that. Virginia has a well owner program through their extension, and in order to make it easier for folks to not have to go to Virginia Tech to take the samples, they have a courier that drives around the state. And on certain days, he's at certain libraries in other communities, and there's a cooler there. People can drop off their samples, and he takes them to Virginia Tech for them. And so it's learning those sorts of strategies and how to make it easier for people Yeah, and then when you get to the bottom here, there are other reasons, personal and social barriers. We'll talk about that as we move down through. So it's because it really becomes a one-on-one type of thing most of the time, and those are more difficult if they have that problem sometimes. So in our regarding barriers, one of the things we cataloged going through all those research papers were all the barriers that folks identified. And so if you remember the slide I showed with the 14 papers, they're all numbered so that we could put them with this information. So where it says source on the right, that's the number of the paper that referenced complacency. For instance, 43, 48, 53, and 88 all reference complacency as one of the problems they had. And this description that we put in here is, as long as the water looks and tastes fine, they feel testing is unnecessary. We tell people all the time, arsenic can be in your water and it's odorless, colorless, and tasteless. That's a reason to test right there, right? But we list a number of barriers, contradictory messages. Mass media often compounds a problem, that's for sure. They want to make a story sometimes, and so their headline is really off base. And so when those things happen, well owners aren't sure who to trust. It really causes confusion. And so, yeah. And so this whole list of barriers, which I believe there are 42 that we put together from all this, even water is not consumed. It's something a lot of people don't consider, is that a number of people are like, well, I'm just going to avoid the whole issue by not drinking water from my well. I'll use it for the shower or for other things, but I'm just not gonna drink it. Well, if you don't know, there's very few things that really are dermal risk or an inhalation risk, but if you don't test, you don't know those things necessarily either. And things like high nitrate, using it for cooking, you're boiling that water, it's concentrating the nitrate, not making it less. And so it's a complication, right? And it makes it a barrier. And it's the message we have is, unless you test, or when you test, you may find out that your water is perfectly fine. And if it is, why are you paying for bottled water? It's a much more expensive alternative. And a lot of times groundwater is perfectly fine. So the other part of that is they can be hard to reach, for a lot of reasons. They come not only because they come from different demographics and all those sorts of things, but a lot of people, like my dad, believe that groundwater is just safe because it's coming from the ground. It's not true. Human nature, I said same for the dentist or doctor. Why don't people go to the dentist when they know they need to? Or why don't they go to the doctor whenever they're having this ache or this problem? They put it off and put it off. They're scared of what might happen. They're scared of what it might cost. All those things, well, that's who we are as humans, right? Same thing with your drinking water. Well, it hasn't killed me, so it's fine, I'm sure. Well, you don't know that, and especially if you've lived in that house and you're drinking that water for a long time, those things lead to problems, or can, if there is an issue. So cost or perceived cost, again, history, no one's gotten sick yet, and just general distrust of the government, no matter who it is. We're technically not a government agency. We're part of the University of Illinois, but we have many state mandates for things. And so, we're looked at the same way. And sometimes that's just an issue and you really have to get around it. I know I went to a meeting one time, we were working in an area trying to do an aquifer assessment. We were going to put in monitoring wells and measure water levels and kind of do a model of the flow in the aquifer. And I spent 20 minutes giving a talk to this group and 2 hours answering questions because they didn't trust, it was 2 communities that were funding the work because they were looking at putting in a regional water supply and no one wanted it. And so these folks sit and grilled me for 2 hours about how I was paid, if there would be 2 reports, one for the public and one for the sponsor, all these things that just made it so clear that they had no trust in me whatsoever because of who's paying for the project. I don't get paid any differently, whether I bring in $1 million or bring in $10. And so, it took several years of working with those folks before some of them started to come around, some never did. But it's just, you have to do what you can. So one of the other things we'll highlight here is this work by Barb Luukkonen and others, Luukkonen, sorry, and others. She was with Minnesota Extension. She retired a number of years ago, but they did a study where they sent out 2,700 questionnaires to 2 counties, to all the private well owners in 2 counties in each of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And in some, they put $2 bill and a free water test to have them complete the survey. Some they just put in a $2 bill, and some they just put in a coupon. And you can see the percentages of return rate went down as the incentive was less. So that was one thing. They were looking at all the social dimensions of all this. But what I want to really highlight are the thing on the bottom left, which is when asked how worried they were about possible health risks if their well water is untreated, 87% they were slightly or not worried at all. Half were not worried at all. And most of these people had never tested their well. And so it's just assuming groundwater is safe. So they gave them a laundry list of reasons why they hadn't tested. And I believe, so they had 1,733 questionnaires or surveys completed in the end. And I believe there were around 1,100 or so who had never tested their well. And they asked them why, and they could check as many of these boxes as they wanted. 53% said we've been drinking it for years. So you can see those were the top 10, and there were more, and they could answer more than once, which is why this doesn't add up. But it's really, these are the things that we should be looking at as barriers and trying to identify ways to get around it. And some of these are knowledge barriers, some of these are risk perception barriers. And so I think actually I'm going to go through that really quickly. So knowledge barriers. I didn't know what to test for. I don't know how to test. I didn't know I should test. Those are things that we can deal with by directly providing, through newsletters or social media or the newspaper, or working with partners like Extension, who have a newsletter that goes out to or Farm Bureau is a good one. If you're in a rural county or rural area, ask them if they'll put a blurb in there about, here's opportunities to test and why you should and all those sorts of things. But we need to get past, first of all, the point where they know the answers to those things before we can even move forward. And then risk perception. I've been drinking it for years. It hasn't killed me yet, is the bottom line, or it hasn't made me sick. Well, maybe it hasn't made you sick, but has anyone else been to your house and actually gotten sick from water? I know we never realized it, but I'm sure when my cousins came to our house and drank our water, some of them got sick, because I know I did after I'd been away for a while. So, it's probably fine. I don't want to know. So I actually had that happen to me. We have an aquifer in Illinois that has a fair amount of arsenic in it. And we were trying to look at the spatial variability because the data we had was from the 80s from that health department, and it was all over the map. It looked like a shotgun blast. You'd have a really high arsenic level, like several hundred parts per billion, and fairly close by would be a well that had, less than the detection limit of 3 at the time. And so we were doing a project where we went into 2 rural subdivisions where all the wells were really close together. It's just like a city street or 2 or 3 city streets, and with a lot of wells. And we got permission from all the well owners to test their well. Well, one gentleman, when I went up to his house, he said, well, you can test my well as long as you do it when I'm not home and you don't send me the results. And I thought, well, that's, really odd. And it turned out he was trying to sell his home. And in Illinois, there's a form you have to fill out when you're selling your home, and it's legally binding. And one of the questions is, do you know of anything adverse about your well or septic system? And so, at least it was at the time. And so he wanted to be able to honestly answer that, no. And so he did not want to know if there was anything in his well. And this was in an area where we knew there was a lot of arsenic. But it just goes to people's motivations can be very different, and maybe not make sense from our perspective, but it's because, I ended up asking, So I did want to know why. And so, yeah, I thought it was interesting. Inconvenience, dealing with problem be costly. I missed the testing program. Yeah, and again, this is from data from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And I'm not sure what they mean by missing the testing program, but it's just another example of if it isn't convenient, yeah, I didn't get around to it, whatever. And then for personal and social, testing costs too much is again, and then I'll wait for others to find problems. Sometimes that's all you need to do is point out that, you know, within a mile of or 2 miles of this location, there was an arsenic hit of 150 ppb, and so it's probably really worth your while to find out if that might be an issue, and that works in those situations a lot of times. So then, once you've identified what the barriers might be, the next step is to select motivations, and that will actually reduce or eliminate those barriers, and it's really reaching to those well owners and changing their minds is the bottom line. And so again, during this literature review, we went through and put together a list of techniques to motivate behavior change. And this, advertising or doing applied education doesn't necessarily address what wording you might use. That's based on what's going on with those folks in that area. But these are approaches to get that message out. And so, and we list all of those. We have 88 of them in the end. One of them, teachable moments. Again, going back to Flint, when something happens and all of a sudden it makes the news, that's an opportunity in a lot of cases that you should really jump on, because people are more likely to be concerned and then be more willing to do something different to protect themselves. And so, whenever they're talking about in Texas, when there were several tens of thousands of wells south of Houston that had been flooded, and that people couldn't drink the water, and blah, 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 that's an opportunity to say, here's why you should be prepared for these sorts of situations. If your well's ever been overtopped, you can do this. But anyway, again, this is available, this list of ideas, if you will. And then for building partnerships, can't say enough about the need for partners. Everything you do, I consider myself more than anything else as a facilitator. I've built relationships with folks all over the country. I value those, and I always try to take the time to help. If someone has a question or needs me to sit on a meeting, there's probably nothing more important than people knowing they can rely on you. And so when you are able to get someone involved, and that's for a lot of reasons, to share the workload, or maybe even they're willing to pay some of the costs, it's really critical to expanding how many people learn about a program and all those sorts of things. And then also building a partnership with the audience, your well owners, being transparent, sharing information with them. I know someone asked a question about in the questions today, that someone asked about some of my personal experiences, and I think that's one of the ones that's probably most important, is sharing information with the folks that you're working with, so that and even trying to explain topics to them. We've done recently some Legionella sampling, and that's scary to people, but if you talk to them and make it clear what's going on and what it really means and what you're after, they're a lot more interested and want to know more, and you've increased their interest in their well. And so yeah, all those are important. So as far as partners go, they can come from a lot of places, right? Civic groups, universities. I say agriculture. Farm Bureau has been one of our best partners, especially in the state. They have a magazine and a radio show and all those things. They've invited us over a number of times to talk and to put in information in their newsletter that goes out to 76,000 farmers in Illinois. But there's a lot of other groups, even banks or other businesses, you know, there's a lot of ways they can help. Maybe you only need, you know, you're running this program and people have to pay for their own water sample, but you know that there's a certain group of people that aren't going to be able to afford to do that. You go to a bank and say, listen, we're doing this project. We expect to have 100 well owners participate. If you would pay for 5 or 10 of those samples for folks who can't afford it, you'll be included as a partner. We'll highlight that you've done this as, you know, being good civic partners, blah, blah, blah. It's a good way to create that relationship. And if it's a positive outcome for them, they're more willing then to participate in the future. I know even our public water supply is privately owned, and they have a fund just for doing projects like that, not necessarily for private wells in that case, but for funding education and outreach efforts, even to help people understand issues related to water quality or you know, those sorts of things. And so the more partners you have to share the glory, but you also get to share the workload, the costs, all the things that are more important. It'll allow you to expand your program and certainly reach more well owners in most cases. And so from our survey, you know, again, I said we in the end, we had to have the people who filled out the survey I self-evaluate themselves. And then the question was and there's actually were 5 answers here. Not very successful, somewhat successful, successful, very successful, or extremely successful. And of the 91 programs, no one answered somewhat successful. And so what we learned from this, because we asked them the number of partners they had and all those sorts of questions, the not very successful programs averaged 1.4 partners. So not even 2, and then the extremely successful programs average 3.2. And so, you know, it fits. It wasn't always the case. You can look at very successful there, and it's a limited data set, but it points out, I think, what we were hoping to show, and what makes sense is that the more partners you have, if everybody's on the same page, the more you can get done and the more successful your program is going to be. And again, partners equal success, and they just do, because they share costs, effort, they can help spread the word, and you can't underestimate the provide local buy-in. So I mentioned, and this isn't really a private well example, but when you can work with a group and find someone who they respect, a local champion, it can make all the difference in the world, because they can spread the word for you. They can vouch for you. I mentioned we had a project where I gave a 20-minute talk and then I was grilled for 2 hours. Well, one of those people and I became friends and got fairly close. And he was a retired water operator in one of the small towns in that area. And probably 15 years after that project was over, we were approached to try to find, it turns out that area is high in arsenic, and it's very similar to the arsenic aquifers in Bangladesh. And there was a group at Cornell trying to develop a new method for collecting samples from within a drill hole, drilling down to a certain depth and then collecting a sample of the soil and water. And they wanted to test it in our aquifer in Illinois. And so they came to us and asked if we could find 3 sites, with 5 acres each, that they could do this work. And we're talking, this is prime farmland, you know, it's worth probably $10,000 an acre, but that provides 200 bushel corn, and they had no money to pay the farmers for taking their land out of production. And so I would have had 0 chance of finding a site over there to do that. But I called this gentleman. who I'd been friends with, who knew everybody and everybody knew him. I told him what was going on. His name was Mel, and within about a week, he had all 3 sites for us. And so you can't underestimate the value of creating those relationships and building those partners. And you never know when it's going to benefit you in even other ways, I guess was my point. And so as far as risk communication and best practices, these are approaches, again, based on the literature review. One-sided versus two-sided messaging, accept and involve the public as partners. Bringing stakeholders together can be costly up front, but it's effective in the long run. What that means, basically, is it takes more work up front to really get your stakeholders involved. And but once you've done that and they consider themselves part of your team, then everything gets a lot easier. It really does, because some of those folks are actually engaged enough that they're being cheerleaders for you, as well as participating. And so you can't, you can't underestimate how valuable that can be, if it's possible. And so, the last one we have here is single session workshops, which I always highlight because that's what we're doing today. It's a great opportunity. I know with some of the research we've done, at the end, like when we've sampled people's wells, we're going to do this for our Legionella work. Once all the results are in, we're going to have a webinar and invite them all. And those that can't make it, we're going to do it in the evening. We're going to record it so they can see it on YouTube or wherever we put it, whenever they want, and understand exactly what we found and overall what that means, not only for their well, but for the water community or the private well community at large. And it's just if you can get them to the table, and we actually have folks who are really interested in what we're doing, so that won't be difficult in this case. But it's a great way to introduce yourself, all those sorts of things. Okay, and the last, earning a trusting relationship. It's about, I guess I got ahead of myself because the Mel story should have been here. Earning trusting relationships, choosing the right messenger, and being credible and trustworthy. So the first part of that is how you advertise your program. So what do you do to get the word out? I guess I'm not sure I talked about this specifically, but I mentioned earlier young versus old. We know that there's studies out there that show that older folks read the newspaper and watch the news. Younger folks are on social media and looking on the web at everything. They're not watching the news. They don't get the newspaper. And so you need to do both of those things. There's a lot of other ways to go about this. Direct mailing, depending on the size of the area you're working in, postcards are a great way to reach homeowners. And especially if it's today, the way the post office is set up, and we're doing this right now actually, we're targeting a direct mailing of postcards to an area in Southern Cook County that's all private wells. We want to sample 100 wells. And so you can go on the post office, US Postal Service website, and you can pick which mail routes. So for each carrier, they have a specific route, and you can go in and target those and how many addresses there are in each, so you can be sure you're not wasting money by sending, postcards to the entire zip code. So there's a lot of cool things that have developed that you can do as far as that goes. Or if someone has a mailing list, Farm Bureau is a good example, or Extension, or some other group, you can send them an email and say, would you mind forwarding this to your members or to your listserv? And if you can make a good case and they see it as a public benefit, then they may be willing to do so. And so, you want to do every one of these you can, is the bottom line. Because the more methods you use, we had one health department we talked to said, we tried to do this work, we were going to offer free samples, and we stuck it on our website, and we never had just a few people take us up on it. Well, you got to think about it like you're the well owner. How many people go to a county health department website on their own? They would only go there if there's a reason. They had a question, they had an issue, and they wanted more information. And so you're reaching hardly no one if you go about it that way. You've got to be the aggressor and put stuff out. I know for our program, we publish on social media almost daily. We put out a newsletter every month. That's for professionals. We're on, yeah, and it's and we're doing things like these webinars. We also have a podcast. I mean, we're trying to find a number of ways to get more information out there and to reach more people. So again, we asked about advertising methods, and again, it worked out like you'd expect it to. The extremely successful programs were using 5.5 methods on average, and the not very successful ones 3.8. And so it's, you know, it's just the data backs up what we believe is true. One thing I do want to point out though is that if you're going to offer incentives like free testing, that's not going to guarantee your program is going to be successful. And you can see from here, more not very successful programs offered free testing than did the extremely successful ones. And it comes down to that it can't just be that there's an incentive there. The people you're trying to reach have to understand the value of that incentive. And so, did they understand the value? What did you do? Or in one case in our survey, it was professional services they offered to well owners. But if you don't make it clear that, you know, here's what this would cost, and this isn't, you know, something that's available anytime, then they may happen. I believe it was the Texas Well Owner Network who told us that they used to offer free testing, and they changed it to just being $15 and said, we're offering this for $15 when if you took it to a lab, it'd cost, you know, 60 or 80 for what they test for. And they have more people than the number of people who are requesting that service went up. And so it's really about understanding whether your audience feels that way, or it may be something with the way you're approaching or providing the background information related to that. And so, yeah, advertising and partners have a bigger effect on your success in the end. And if you have those things figured out, you're more likely to have an incentive that does its job. So, and brings a few more people in. Yeah, so demonstrating the value is key, and figuring out how to do that is certainly important. So I think this is the only slide that is for exceptional programs. Here's our take on what an exceptional program has. They're engaged, they have committed staff, they've developed experience over time, and it's not surprising that a lot of programs that listed as exceptional or were very successful had staff that had been involved with private well issues for more years than the others, so to speak. You have to be willing to openly work with partners to share costs, effort, success. If you're trying to do it on your own and going for all the glory yourself, that doesn't necessarily work out. And so it really, the more folks you can involve, you'll win out in the end. I mean, our program is really successful today, and it's because of all the partners we work with and we continue to work with. And so, there's no doubt about that. There's a lot of people who've went to bat for us and provided insights and taught us things we didn't know. There's just a lot of, I can't think of anything but benefits from having more partners than less. Identify well owner needs and understand audience before starting work. Yeah, when you try to just go out there and throw out, hey, we're going to offer free testing, if they're not familiar with you as a group or they're concerned, I'll mention, I have so many well owners contact me and I say, you should contact your local health department. They're like, well, what if the health department tells me I can't use my water? And what I tell everyone is, if you're concerned with that, in the first place, 99% of health departments don't have that authority. and it used to be 100%. But now I know I've learned from some of the folks out east, there was actually 2 health districts in Connecticut. I talked to their lead, private well lead, and they had written their own regs, and it did give them the authority to condemn wells. And that's the only place I know of that's like that. Other than Rhode Island passed a more restrictive law than New Jersey's, and they've tied getting your home well tested at property sale to their building code. And their building inspector has the authority to condemn a property if the well has a contaminant that's a health risk and it isn't remediated. So in effect, if it was serious enough, Rhode Island now has the ability to condemn a property to force the landowner to remediate their water quality issue. But that said, in all the rest of the U.S., I tell people the health departments are there to help you. They certainly care about your health, and if you're drinking water that's not safe, but they can't force you not to drink it, unless it's a spill or some other thing where they come in and the state comes in and those sorts of things. And I tell well owners honestly that if you're concerned, call your health department first and find out your local health department and ask them what rules will they have and what jurisdiction they have and what they can legally do. Can they actually force you to not drink your water? And if they say yes, then you have to make that decision for yourself, but you could always call a different health department and ask for advice if you're concerned. And it comes down to, again, people don't have the money. I certainly am not encouraging anyone to drink water that's not safe, but that's an individual decision. And we're trying to give them all those options. So the other things, you have to be adaptable to change and changing needs. When Flint happened, that changed a lot of people's attitudes towards a lot of things related to their wells. Now we have PFAS, which isn't going to go away for a long time. And, more and more comes out about that almost every day, about how to deal with it, about what the health risks might be. And so you just have to stay in the game. And lastly, I mentioned this earlier, you have to stick around. You need to be there. You may have say you did have a grant for 2 years and were able to help a lot of well owners, and now that grant's gone. If they call you after that and you're like, well, I'm not working on this anymore, I can't help you, that's burning a bridge. And so you have to be willing, if you're going to get into this, to be a resource, whether you're funded or not. So if someone calls you in 5 years and has a question, you can either help them or give them to a person who can help them, because that's what they need. So, and I refer a lot of people, honestly. I certainly don't have all the answers, and I know there's a lot of folks that, and especially some topics, that know a lot more than I do. And so I lean on those people when I need to. So all this data, and I know Katie put it as, it's a handout as well, but all the things that I've brought up so far are actually available as at this email address, or sorry, web address. So our website is privatewellclass.org, and there's, if you put /appendix, it'll take you to a page that's got all this information you can download. But like the yellow highlighted material from today, the barriers, motivations, and communication stuff is on there. We also, I know what I wanted to show, I think, yeah. So also, we asked, as question 26 on our survey was the last question, we asked every participant if we could make their data public. So we had that as part of the survey so that we could do what we wanted with the data. 83 of the 91 said yes. And so we've got a PDF of all 26 questions, or all 25 questions, I believe, and all of the answers. Some of them are a book, and some of them are pretty short. But like, so question 24, which the end of is at the top of this page, is, was your program successful, and why or why not? And so number 83 said we didn't meet our target goal of 250 surveys, but we did, and this is Lower Yakima Valley, that's in Washington State. And so they now the well owners are engaged, they participate, they promote their program to their friends and neighbors. And so they realize that they are successful and that they're probably going to be more successful down the road because, they've done things the right way and they've worked with folks. Question 25 was, what would you do differently? And, or, what would you do to improve your program? Excuse me. I need to take a drink real quick. And I thought this was a really good answer, so I highlighted it. I think being consistent, slow and steady to build a reputation, and then advertising however you can to make well owners aware of what you're doing. Finding what motivates a well owner or is a barrier to their participation is the key. It's like, and this is before I did all this, so this person really gets it. So, but you can go through all of those. Those are also available, and it as well as the survey questions we asked is available. And so the idea there is hopefully you all can use that information for your benefit as you, I always tell people that ask that, reading through all this is a worthwhile exercise just because you get a lot of different perspectives on, and there's a few people who clearly don't get it. They basically put it on the well owner and, we all have to be the cheerleaders and the ones who are pushing information out. And the idea is if we wait for well owners to come to us, we're really not going to get anywhere. And this is that page. If you go to privatewellclass.org/appendix, and I'll mention here, the assessment tool is there too, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, because that's an important tool that you can use when you're working with well owners individually. But we've listed these as Appendix A, B, C, and D, because originally we were going to, besides doing the paper, we were going to write a contract report that we could pass out freely. It wasn't a deliverable and we ran out of time. And so the real important part, in my opinion, is that we've made this data available to everyone. So, and also on this page are links to all the 6 RCAP regions on the right. If you want to reach out to someone in your, if they're in your state, you can do it that way again, or you can contact us. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit quickly about our private well class program if you're not aware. This is our front page, privatewellclass.org. The main component of the program is a 10-lesson class for well owners, and you click on Take Our Free Class or Learn by Email, and it takes you to a page where you can sign up with your email address, your first name, and what state you live in. And that's honestly just so that we can show our sponsor, EPA, that we're reaching folks in all 50 states, which we do, as well as other countries. And we've had about 12,000 people take this class since we started it, which is great. And so, and then it sends you an email with a lesson or PDFs once a week for 10 weeks. There's a pre-test at the beginning and a post-test at the end and an evaluation that asks you to fill out on what you like or don't like. For every person that tells us 7 days is too long between lessons, we have another person that says 7 days is, I can't keep up and I don't have that much time. So these are going to stack up until I have a chance to do anything. So we think we've probably got that about right. It really depends on how interested someone is or how fast they want to go through it, or if they do any of the extra lessons and stuff that are available. For each lesson, there's a set of resources on our webpage under the resource library. For lesson 1 is called The Science of Groundwater. And so, each lesson is 6 to 10 pages long that we put together. But we also included all these links. Most of these are, all of these are actually from universities or governmental type agencies that provide resources for well owners. And so, the point is we've written the class in a conversational way. It's like we're talking to each other or we're talking to you and explaining things. And if that doesn't resonate with a particular well owner, they can go to these resources and learn more information. And people certainly do use them. We ask that in our evaluation. A lot of folks say they've gone to some of these websites or some of these documents. I assume you know about our webinar page since you're here. You may have learned about it another way, like through our newsletter, but under webinars events, this lists all the webinars that we're going to do. And below that are the past webinars, which we put on YouTube and make available. These are all recorded. So for instance, I know someone asked about lead in one of the questions, and I answered this there too, but we did 2 webinars on lead, one in 2016 and one in 2018. We brought in an expert from Virginia Tech who was involved with a lot of lead work, both at Flint and her own work working with private well owners in Virginia and North Carolina. Boy, excuse me, I'm having trouble here. And so, and I'll go through this when I answer the question at the end, but lead is not a groundwater issue. It's a plumbing issue and it's a pipe issue. And so it affects everyone, not just community water supplies that you're reading in the news about lead service lines and all those things. If your home has lead pipes or galvanized pipe or copper pipe with lead solder that's of a certain age before lead-free was the requirement, then you may be at risk depending on the chemistry of your water. And this explains all that. And it's worthwhile to go through it. And we haven't done this since 2018 because really all the information you need is in this webinar. And so yeah, we just make it available to everyone. So one thing, if I haven't mentioned, everything that we do and all the resources we provide are all completely free to you and well owners. And and that's because we're fortunate to be grant funded to do that. So usually July, but this last year was in August, we do a septic system webinar. We're actually getting more involved with projects that involve on-site disposal systems, not just septic systems, but aerobic ones and others, the alternative innovative systems. And so we're doing that in July. We have a gentleman from RCAP who was a county sanitarian for 8 years. I say county, local health district sanitarian, who inspected septic systems. And so he is our expert because I am not. And I give all the overview and then he answers everybody's questions. He's really smart and knows a lot about those systems. And I encourage you, if you have a septic system and you're a well owner, to participate. We have a series of short videos, 4 to 6 minutes long, on a bunch of different topics. What is a gravel aquifer, standing gravel aquifer? What is a bedrock well? What to do after a fire? What should I know about a shared private well? It turns out that this is something that I wasn't that aware of 10 years ago, but there are a lot of shared wells all over the country. Washington State actually regulates down to 2 homes on 1 well as a special class of public water supply, but most states follow the EPA's guidelines, and it's 15 homes or 25 people to be considered a public water supply. So we have a lot of places where there may be 4 homes or 5 homes on a well, and there turns out there's a lot of issues, and a lot of neighbors who aren't very neighborly once a pump fails and everyone has to pony up money to fix it, or some of those sorts of things. And so it's really highlights one of the issues that's out there that isn't really prevalent as far as folks talk about it a lot. Why does my well keep losing pressure? So we have another video like this that's how does my pressure tank work? It's had over 400,000 views since 2016. And it tells us that a lot of folks have pressure problems that are on private systems, and that there's not a lot of good information out there on the basics of, where your pressure should be set at and some of those things, depending on and those issues. And again, these are short just to give people an idea of how those things work, what a pressure switch is, all that sort of stuff. We started a podcast 2.5 years ago, I guess, September of 21. It looks like, so the first one would have been on September 1st. And so I highlighted 4 of these that are actually related to private wells. So it's called Tap Talk, the Drinking Water in Rural America podcast. And I forgot to put the URL here, but the URL for this podcast is drinkingwaterpodcast.org, one word. So we bring in folks from all walks of life that are related Jackie McDonald Gibson down at the bottom right is a professor at North Carolina State. She's done a ton of work looking at environmental justice issues related to private wells and the folks who live on those wells. She's doing a big study for EPA right now looking at PFAS. Dr. Wolf is the head of pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital. He deals with some really crazy cases of children's health that sometimes end up being related to their private well. And so really interesting stuff. I mentioned Brian Swisstock. He's retired now, but we managed to catch Brian before he did and just talk about some of the things he's done. He's tried a lot of innovative approaches for outreach to well owners. Some worked, some failed. They tried an app that didn't work out, but other things have been wildly successful. And then Eric Yegi is the head of the Water Quality Association, and talking about one of the biggest fears people have is they have to use treatment, how they know they're not getting sold a bill of goods, so to speak. And so they talk about their training program and certificate program for those providers. And he's actually, since I've known Eric, they brought a lot of legitimacy to what the Water Quality Association does to support all the folks using treatment equipment, and is a good resource if you have those sorts of questions. And again, this isn't just about private wells. We interview folks on the drinking water side too, or the public water supply side. And so there's a mixture, but it's really meant to be at the intersection of kind of rural America and public health is kind of the goal we have. And so the private well program overall, really what we want well owners to get is that if they have a log or they can get their log, they understand their log. They know where their water's coming from. They know where their pump's set, if it's above ground or if it's set in, if it's submersible, if they have a screen or not, is it a bedrock well or a sand and gravel well? How deep is it? What are the things do they need to know? If it's a bedrock well, how much casing does it have? People are like, well, my well's 600 feet deep. Well, if you only have 25 or 30 feet of casing, if it's an older well because it's a bedrock well, then water can get in their well at 30 feet. That's not really, being 600 feet deep doesn't really mean it's protected. And so a lot of things like that. They should know if there are any naturally occurring contaminants or water quality issues with their water source. And so, that's something we encourage people to be inquisitive, to contact their state resource agency and ask. And like if they call their local health district or county health department and say, do you know if our aquifer has any naturally occurring contaminants? If they don't know, they'll know to contact who at the state and give that person then the right source to talk to. And it's, encouraging those sorts of things so that well owners become more knowledgeable. And not only do they learn to ask the right questions, but they learn to ask better questions and who their local sources of information actually are. And then lastly, of course, sample their well. So the goal overall is to help them understand why their well's important, why they should understand how it works, and how that can help them protect themselves from risk. And so we're going to answer some of the questions you have now. Oh, actually, no, we're not. I didn't change that slide. I added a few more. Since this presentation is really mostly about professionals and not so much for well owners, I included a few extra things that we have that are geared towards professionals, including that I mentioned this earlier. NEHA has our private well class, the 10 lessons, on their e-learning website. You can take each one for a CE, and if we also work with ASHRAE, which is home inspectors, their staff can go to NEHA's website and create a login and take the class, and they can get accreditation as a home inspector for doing that as well. And so you don't have to pay to be a member of NEHA to do that. Our agreement with them is that it's free. And so you do have to create a login on their site, but that's all you have to do. Then you can get to the free training and that sort of thing. And workshops around the country by RCAP regional staff. Again, if you're interested in holding a workshop, working with RCAP, or you want one of them to be your speaker, they speak at a lot of events, groundwater associations and other things like that, or at the request of a local health district or a state agency. Also, we've developed an assessment tool and it's a private well or spring assessment tool. It's really meant to be a one-on-one with a well owner that you take out in the field, and you can look at their well, you find out information about their well, about what kind of piping they have, all those things, their septic system. And this says soon we'll have a guide and tablet. This is an old slide as well, because we do have a guide in a tablet version. And then, we have a partners page where you can get to our newsletter that goes out once a month. So the newsletter, if you go to under resource library that says partner newsletter, it comes out once a month. Katie actually puts that together every month, and you just sign up, and then it sends you an email with that newsletter. We try to highlight information that's useful. I know we were working with the Groundwater Guardians group in Western Illinois. We turned it into a learning experience for all the local health departments in West Central Illinois. We actually we made it available for credit for LEHPs, and we sealed a well. This was in Macomb, Illinois. It's actually in town, 4 blocks from downtown, and it's a community that's had public water since 1916. Yeah, here we go. These people bought this house. There was a concrete slab with a little 2-inch hole or 3-inch hole in the middle. Turned out there's an old dug well that had never been filled in. And you can see on this picture that the round brick well now has a flat side along the foundation. And because that wasn't filled in, the foundation's starting to push out, and it flattened the brick there. And so it's really important they got that sealed. But we made a video of that's available online. It's 6 or 7 minutes long on how to seal a shallow, I think this was a 22-foot well in the end. More from our newsletter, September, it's all about Septic Smart Week. EPA has a program called Septic Smart. There's a lot of partners from a lot of organizations around the country that participate. We try to highlight that, and we were involved with EPA in that program. And so it's something that you as a professional can highlight to remind people that they need to make sure they're pumping their tanks or doing whatever they need to do to learn more about it. We have a lot of people contact us for our webinar and ask us, how do I find my septic tank? They don't even know where it's at. So they've obviously never pumped it or taken care of it or maintained it. So the site assessment, it's really, it's actually a fairly extensive document. It has 18 sections, and not only a site assessment, but it's a well assessment, a geologic assessment, and then it gives you an opportunity to make recommendations to a well owner. You really shouldn't have your dog tied to the well, or you really shouldn't store this next to the well, or you really need to mound up the dirt around your well so the water runs away from it, and or this is an area subject to ponding, you might want to raise the casing higher, all those sorts of things. And so it allows you to raise awareness about also testing and best management practices. And if somebody happens to be in a vulnerable geology or have bad well construction, you can point out why that's a risk. And so it's a really cool tool. This is just the front page, the first 3 sections. So it just gives you an idea of the detail. Whoever the assessor is really has to have some wherewithal, although we do have a guide that goes with this now that basically covers every box. And so you can learn more. It asks about things like backflow devices, which a lot of people look at you like, what's a backflow device? And it gives you a chance to explain that to them. It's kind of like if you're familiar with a sanitary survey on a public water supply side, it's kind of like the sanitary survey for a private well, although there's no authority there to make people change anything. It's an opportunity to educate them about their specific situation and what best practices they should be following. It also gives you a chance to spend a couple hours with a well owner, which encourages them later to call you or to be more willing to call others and increase their awareness of what's going on with their well. The RCAP regions, originally when this was put together, it was for RCAP to go out and do assessments. It's actually part of the deliverable on our grant with EPA. And since that started, now they've done, each of the 6 regions have done over 550 of these, and that continues to grow every year. And what that's done is made a whole new group of folks, well experts, if you will. So, I work closely with the 6 leads, but there's some other staff as well. But all of those folks, we all work together. We all bounce questions off each other. Whenever you go to 550 wells over the course of 4 or 5 years and actually have to deal with some really unique and interesting situations, you learn a lot about wells. And so it's really helped our program overall, just because it's helped all of us grow and learn. And so there's a fillable PDF version, as well as a tablet version for iOS and Android. You know, this was developed before there were before tablets with Windows were really popular. We do not have a Windows version, nor we probably ever do that, because you can just fill out the PDF. And there's a guide that kind of explains all the different sections. You can see here this shows septic system is section 10. We asked about water quality, if they've tested. You know, these are all, it's something you hand back to the well owner in the end. And it's a really good resource for them, because you make recommendations, you give them pictures of what you did. If you found any information from the county or local health district or the state, you can append it to the PDF that you provide to them. And so they have a really nice record of their well at that snapshot in time that they can use when they have a problem down the road as well. And you can get to that from our resource library page. There's a WellAssess app. It takes you to the paper-based tool and the guide. And so the guide is really pretty extensive. It goes through what to do for recommendations, suggestions, and all that stuff. We also put on a conference. The first one was in 2017 in Champaign, and it was 3 days, 26 talks. It's not a research conference. It's meant to be practical information conference. The goal was that if someone from a county or local health district came to this meeting, they would go home with more tools and ideas to do outreach and support the well owners in their jurisdiction. And so we record every presentation. And so all of these are online on our YouTube channel. We also did one in 2019. This is from 2017. Our first speaker was Barb Luukkonen, who I mentioned and did that survey. We invited her down even though she was retired, and she graciously agreed and talked about all the work they did gathering all that data, which is still the biggest kind of social dimension type survey that we've seen anyone do related to private wells in the country. 2019, we went to Pennsylvania. It's the one state I mentioned that doesn't have a well construction code or a licensing of drillers. And so our keynote speaker was Todd Giddings, who is a local hydrologist who helped a watershed district in Pennsylvania develop a well code of their own. So if you're going to drill in their watershed district, you have to follow their code, which is really interesting that that's what's happened, because there's not a state rule. And then we also did virtual conferences in 21 and in 22. We did not hold a conference this year. They're always in May, but we are going to hold one next year, and it's likely going to be in California. And we tried to move it around the country. In 25, it'll probably be in Minnesota. We'll see. No promises on that 25 one. I want to point out this brochure we developed. It's really meant to be just a generic thing like that would sit on in your lobby area, or where people come in an entrance, like at a health department. So it's a trifold. It just says, "Is your water safe?" And on the inside, it's like, you should get your water tested. You should follow these best practices about testing, inspecting, keeping a file, taking care of your septic system. And then you should learn more about how your well works and how to solve problems. And it takes you back to it suggests you sign up for our class. And so we offer this printed, folded, ready to go to anyone that wants it. And this yellow box I put on here is we left that spot blank on purpose, so that if we send you 100 of these and you're going to pass them out, you can stick your logo and your phone number and email address or web address on there. And so this program has been really successful. It's also available in Spanish. We've had 5 printings of this now, and I believe we've printed 93,000 of these and given out probably close to 86,000 of them around the country. And Indiana State Lab, they requested 2,000 of these, and every well sample they do, they put one of these in the results they send back to the well owners. And so our program's been vetted, if you will, by a lot of different folks and a lot of different agencies. You can find our URL on probably about 500 websites if you look. And if anybody's interested in these, our email address will show up at the end. You can let us know. But you know, the more awareness we can do, and we print them and we ship them to you all for free. And we just put it. This is an older one, but you know, request your free well water. This is from 21. We printed 80,000. Now we're up to 93, I guess. So anyway, so to our questions, we got 15 minutes here. Again, if you have questions that came up because of today, you can put them in the question or the chat box. Katie's monitoring that. And we have a shared Google Doc that I'll pull up at the end. And it looks like we have 3 questions so far, but I'll get to the questions that we were going to answer for today. And these all came from the questions that you all asked in advance. Our screening clinics, which offer free nitrate and chloride, and I'm asking, did you mean to say coliform, test to private well owners, an effective strategy? And I just want to say, typically, when you have one of these kind of clinics, you would, nitrate and coliform are the 2 main things that people test for. And a lot of times, you know, those indicate a pathway into your well. And so that's why I think that's probably what that means. And, you know, they certainly can be, they definitely can be effective. Again, it's how you advertise it, some of those other things, but it makes people aware if they have coliform or nitrate, then you can give them recommendations on what to do next, all that sort of stuff. I know the Texas Well Owner Network has such a program where they have a 1-hour workshop and a half-day workshop, and they go all over Texas. You know, they reach thousands of people a year, I believe. And because they've been doing this for a while and they're respected and they've built a good reputation. And so, you know, Texas is a huge state and it takes them a while to get everywhere they need to go, but they do so many a year. And it's an opportunity then to get those folks not only to come in and bring a water sample, but then to sit in on either an hour or a half-day educational thing about not only their wells, but their septic and some of those things. But again, be sure that well owners know about it and the value of the testing. Those are probably the keys to making that successful. What's the best way to convince well owners that non-mandatory water testing should be completed on a regular basis? And do you have any funding sources available for those who see cost as an issue for water testing? So hopefully we've shown you today that there's a lot of ways to get your well owners involved and engage them. It really involves first understanding who they are and what motivates them, and figuring out what's the best way to convince them. And then, you know, yeah, I wish there was an easier way, but it really does you need to get to know the people you're working with. And if they feel comfortable, like being able to just call you, that's actually a good thing. I know it means it might disrupt your day, but it's the way, you know, that public service and is really an important piece of that. And so on the funding side, it's really been the biggest problem. It's probably the biggest question we get. Is I get a lot of calls from people who, you know, I just had a call from a gentleman the other day who said, hey, you know, my pump failed. I don't have the money to fix it. He's a cancer patient, you know, really in a bad spot. And it turns out there's a lot of folks who can't afford, you know, a one-time expense like replacing a well or installing a new pump. And so there are a few federal grant programs for funding like CDC, and then if we're talking about testing, going back to that, I mentioned that CDC program in Madison County earlier, but if you've got someone with the wherewithal to write a proposal for a project, then you know, that's great. It might get you a long way down the road. I know Gaston County, South Carolina, I believe, they wrote a proposal to fund building a database of all their wells in their county because they had everything on paper and they were able to do that. But it gives them a lot more, you know, you can work with the data a lot better once you have all that information electronically. And so the idea would be if you could get funded, then you know, you work on generating local support for extending that project after the funding's gone, or see if you can't get it funded again. But for locally supporting sampling for well owners, it really comes down to bringing in a partner that can help, in my opinion, like a bank or a civic group. So maybe as large as, as part of a larger project, say that you're going to offer a discount, or if you can't even do that, you run a campaign about testing for some certain constituent. If you could then go to some other group and say, we expect 100 well owners to participate in this program. We know that there's a need for some folks who can't afford the fee. Would you be willing to pay for 5 or 10 of these samples? And they get advertising out of it. They get, they feel good about it. You feel good about it. You help people who maybe wouldn't have done it otherwise. But yeah, if you want to talk about this part of things further, I'd be glad to discuss it with you. Just email us and I can get back to you, or you want to give me a call. Yeah, I'm not sure how we can help, but we can certainly try. Going back to lead, so are there any sort of strategies, technical assistance funding, or in place for private well owners that have had lead service lines connected to their privately owned wells? Okay, so because it's a private well, it's not technically a lead service line, if you will. Didn't have room to mention that, but lead service lines are the part between, well, I guess I did. Service lines are the line from the water main to the home in a public water supply. So that doesn't address what goes on after the service line in the house. And I thought, I actually saw where a state or a few states might be trying to find a way to fund replacing lead lines in homes, but I couldn't find anything, and I reached out to ASDWA, the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, and they too said that they weren't aware of any program for private homeowner or private well owners. So the real issue, though, is whether you're in a private well or a public well. Once they replace that lead service line, that doesn't do anything to help you as a homeowner, whether you're in a community or not. If you have lead plumbing or copper plumbing with lead solder or galvanized plumbing in your home, all of those can leach lead. And so, I know in some parts of the country they use galvanized drop pipe in the well. And so if your home has any kind of lead, or any of the lines have any kind of lead, copper, or galvanized, then that could still be leaching lead into your home. And again, I already showed the webinar earlier, but if you go to privatewellclass.org/lead, there's some resources there and a link to the 2018 webinar. It's a simple URL. And yeah, it's going to be a problem, now that it's not being used anymore. Eventually, as homes get replaced or plumbing gets replaced, you'll see this issue go away, but we're talking 50 or 100 years unless people do anything about it. We actually have a project at the Water Survey. It's not me, it's the head of our groundwater section, Walt Kelly, but they've got funding from HUD to investigate lead in homes with private wells in Illinois, and they've sampled 150 houses. And part of the effort is to actually remediate their lead problem if they have one. And that includes, for a few homes, actually getting rid of all their pipes and putting all new ones in. And so it'll be interesting to see how that comes out. But it's, it's a novel solution in a way, because no one really has the funding just to replace all their plumbing in their home. That's quite an expense. And so they're also looking at a few other options, including, under sink treatment systems and things like that. So, is there any financial assistance for residents on a brickstone lined well? And the ... was in Illinois, but this really covers everybody in the country who want to get a new well that's to code. There really is only one program, and that's the USDA's program under this Farm Bill, which provides really low interest loans, 1%, I believe, that are administered through a bunch of nonprofits, including RCAP, by the way. The funding comes from the Farm Bill, which is going to be reauthorized this next year. And the reason I bring that up is the Farm Bill is authorized every 5 years. It covers a ton of different things. It's a huge thing. It'll be all over the news when they start doing it. But they changed it this last time in 2018 or 19 so that to be eligible for those funds, you have to be at 60% or less of the median household income in your area. And that's before it was 100% or 80% maybe, but 60% of the MHI for any area is going to be really low and only apply to a few people. And so right now, basically, very few people actually qualify for that funding. And so I know there's a push by a lot of different organizations to raise that to 100% of the MHI, which is, at least the median household could get this 1% loan. But that's really up to our federal legislators and what they do with the Farm Bill. And so, if this matters to you and you have any sway with anyone, and you certainly have the right to contact your federal legislator and ask them about this and ask them to change that rule, because the money's there and they can't use it, is the bottom line, and they're not able to get it out the door because there's just not enough people who actually qualify. And so we see a lot of people who are really struggling to pay their bills and everything else who should be able to get this loan and they can't. So, and it's like a 20-year loan. It makes it very affordable. Yeah. Can you share any personal successful case studies or examples of outreach campaigns or initiatives that have effectively increased awareness and adoption of best practices among private well owners? So a lot of the work I've done with well owners hasn't been necessarily just increasing awareness about sampling or some of those things, except for our private well class, which we do reach a lot of people. There's no doubt about that. But for research projects, we either sample wells or we measure their well depth if we're trying to get an idea of the water levels in an aquifer, things like that for applied research projects. So I'm going to mention a few of those. We had a water authority in Illinois that was concerned that a community water supply was planning to put a well field out in the middle of the country, and it was going to affect all the private wells out there. So they wanted us to measure all the wells and all the pump settings so that we could use the groundwater model we developed to determine how many wells might be impacted depending on where they place this well field. So in order to do that, we actually, and this was when it was still, you sent it to the entire zip code, but we printed postcards and said we were gonna have a public meeting to discuss this. And we sent it out to like 5 zip codes. It was 9 townships. But the area where the well field would go was only in like 4 of those. And so we sent it out to all the rural residents in those 4 zip codes. But all the people there were up in arms because they knew that the 2 large communities that were west of them or east of them might be putting a well field out there. And so by having that public meeting, we were able to, normally at a public meeting like that, I'd get 20 or 25 people. I think we had almost 100 show up. And the deal was we were going to go door to door and measure water levels. And so getting folks to let you do that is a big deal. And so we hired 5 geology students from a university that spent the summer doing that. And we had them all at the meeting where people could meet them and tell their neighbors, and that these young folks are going to come out and, blah, blah, blah. And so we found 1,708 wells, and I really expected most of those people to say no to opening their well and actually letting us take a water level measurement, and we had over 500 who said yes. And I think it's partly because we let them know in advance. They knew that this was a concern because they were scared of Big Brother coming in and stealing all their water, all those sorts of things. Another project we did worked with an FFA chapter. Actually 5 FFA chapters. I don't know if you're familiar with FFA. It stands for Future Farmers of America. It's a high school organization. It's really big in the Midwest because we have a lot of farm kids. I was one of them. And so after the flooding we had, and I'm dating myself, in 1993, the Mississippi flooded and the Illinois River flooded, we put together doing a project to go out and sample for coliform and nitrate in private wells that were in these floodplains in these areas where it's a historic 500-year flood. So for each of those 5 school districts, we decided to have a public meeting, and we had the FFA kids advertise it and send it out like through the school newsletter and in the local papers. And then we had a public meeting before we did all the sampling to explain it. And because we were working with the FFA kids, everyone accepted us. And so, I mean, it made a huge difference. They came up and the well owners could ask for a kit. They delivered them. They went and picked them up. And then in the end, after we got the results, we provided all the results in their science classes. We taught them for a day. So it was really fun too. But by working with, they were a trusted insider. They're all the farm kids in each of these school districts. We had almost 1,000 samples from 5 school districts that maybe had 800 kids total in those 5 school districts. They were all small schools. So that was, I think, really successful in that respect. So sharing results, recorded webinar, I mentioned that earlier. We're doing a project right now, sampling for Legionella in some private wells in Illinois. And we've actually found some. And so we're sharing those results and explaining what they mean, not to alarm everyone and just make them aware. And also we're planning to do a webinar here. We should get the last of our results in the next few weeks actually. And so sometime in July, we'll probably do a webinar for the well owners where they can ask us questions. We can share some best practices they can do to help eliminate that concern, all that sort of stuff. And lastly, I mentioned that assessment tool. It's been really successful. They've done over 3,300 of those themselves. I've done a number. We've got, the idea behind creating the assessment tool was not to just have RCAP use it, but to make it available to any county or state health department that wanted to do that kind of work. We don't use the information in those assessments to create summary statistics or any of those things. We're really not allowed to because this is an education and outreach program, not a research program, and so it's not considered research data, but that doesn't stop anyone else who wants to do this from doing their own projects, and that's actually happened. The Health Foundation of Central Massachusetts funded a project in Massachusetts where I know they've sampled about 180 wells, and they're actually putting all the data in a database, and they're looking at statistics, and they're really understanding better what the risk is in Massachusetts for certain, given certain geologies and stuff in certain areas, what kinds of contaminants they have. And so it's been really successful in that respect too. Okay, so encouraging, okay. Do you have any advice for a state agency encouraging and funding county governments to conduct private well water outreach campaigns? So I want to say it's awesome your state's funding counties to do these activities because I know of Iowa and I don't know of any others. So if you're not Iowa, it'd be great if you let me know. And so, but like anything else, you have overachievers and you have underachievers. And I think I'm assuming that's your question, but I'm not 100% sure. And I think the best approach would be to highlight all the overachievers. Surely there's some of those counties that are taking this money and running with it. So collect metrics on all the counties, ask them to provide you here what they've done with the money, how many well owners they've helped, or whatever metrics you come up with, and then share that with everyone. Make the underachievers realize that someone's paying attention and that these other counties are doing all of this. Sometimes that's what it takes, is not to want to be looked as lesser than your peers. And so maybe a quarterly email or newsletter. You can also offer to participate in some of their events just to keep them engaged and know you're paying attention, and then also provide them resources if they're trying to start the program. Hopefully the materials from today will give you some ideas on that, but I'd also be glad to help. Just let me know whether we can do a webinar with your counties or provide brochures for you, or if you think of something else, I'm more than willing to get involved. I think it's a noble effort, and it's great that you're taking the interest. And I wish more states were doing what you guys are doing. So that's my email address. If people aren't required to register a domestic well, how can you engage private well owners? So just to be clear, so no state has all the records for every private well in their state. Some are better than others. There's a lot of reasons why, but no state has a complete inventory. We started requiring well logs in 1968 in Illinois, and we probably have 50 to 60% of the well logs that are in use in our state. New York didn't start requiring that until 2000. They probably have 10 to 15% of all their well logs for the wells that are in use in New York State. So no one leans on registered domestic wells as how to find their well owners and engage them. That's my point. They're literally everywhere there isn't a public water system, right? So like I showed earlier, the Chicago metro area, they're even there, even though you'd think that was all public water supplies. So hopefully you found some ideas today that'll help you understand what you need to do to reach well owners. It doesn't require you to know anything about whether they've registered their well or not to start with. If you have that information, that's great, especially if you can share it with them, because they may not realize anything about their well and you can help them. But there's groups like Extension, Farm Bureau, put info in their newsletters, talk to well drillers. There's just so many different groups you can talk to. Your local health district, if that's not who you're with. So yeah, you don't need to know their names in advance to start an outreach program. And no one that I know actually has all that information and uses it as a starting point. We needed 15 more people for our Legionella sampling because we had a few drop out from those we did last year. And so I put out an email through our listserv, which I work at PRI, which is a Prairie Research Institute, which houses all the scientific surveys. There's almost 1,000 employees, and I needed 15 wells. I had it within 2 days or within a day. I sent out to the entire group, hey, does anybody have a private well and be interested in doing this work? Here's what it's going to entail, blah, 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 blah. And I had a bunch of people, way more than I needed, sign up. They're just interested in getting their well tested. And again, it's you'd expect that because most of them are scientists, but there's a lot of ways to go about doing these things whenever you just have to think outside the box if you need to. Also, the US EPA recently developed a protocol for estimating domestic wells all over the country. The last time domestic wells were asked as a question for water source was on the 1990 census, but there's also a housing survey, and by looking at census blocks or groups, I can't remember which, and estimating the number of new homes in each of those groups and knowing information about wells from prior to that, they've estimated the number of wells by census block, or again, it might be census group. I'm going to show you in a minute. So I didn't have a chance to pull this URL up. I actually put this slide in here right before we started today because I forgot about it, and I'm like, oh yeah. And so anyway, when you go to this website, it shows you all the, and I did Pennsylvania just because they're a state that doesn't have a well construction code and rules. And I clicked on a census block near Pittsburgh, and it shows that in 2010, which is the last census data that was available for this, there were almost 1,600 people. There are 980 housing units, and 81% use wells. So if you're happen to be in that particular area, a postcard would be a great thing. You have to send out 1,000 postcards. That's a few $100s probably, well, a little more than that, but and you're going to reach everyone. 81% of those 980 households are estimated to have private wells. So this is a really cool tool. On an individual basis, for an individual block, you may see data that doesn't represent your area that closely, but I think what we've seen looking at Illinois, it does a pretty good job. The prior estimate in Illinois was that there were about 500 to 600,000 wells in use. And I always argued that it was higher than that from what I've seen and the work that I've done here for the last 30 years. And the estimate they came up with using this methodology was close to 800,000, which is right where I'd put it. And so I think there's a lot of useful data. It certainly lets you know where the private wells are in your area down to the census block, which is pretty cool. I am tasked to serve the entire state of New Hampshire as a private well coordinator with about 500,000 residents drinking water from private wells. I could use advice on how to stretch limited resources. And one thing I want to say about New Hampshire is you also have a lot of communities that are all private wells. They're not public water supplies. And so when you put all those private wells in a dense area like that, and they all have septic, I'm assuming a lot of them do, in close proximity, that's a recipe for problems, especially if it's bedrock's close to the surface, some of those things. And I know you have better septic rules than we do in Illinois, but it's still an issue. I'd start there. That's where you're going to work with the local health districts where the communities are, and where they're all private wells, and should get more return that way, in my opinion. If you want to look at other factors as far as equitable issues, you can certainly figure that out too from census data, which communities probably have a greater need and have less wherewithal to do anything about their well situation. So the other people I talked to are both with RCAP Solutions. Mark Johnson, and I'm going to guess you might know both of these people, but Mark Johnson is the private well lead. He's actually in Vermont, but he helps cover all the area for RCAP Solutions. And then Jim Starboards is a Massachusetts state lead. He's a sanitarian who does our septic webinar for us, and he's also the person involved with this project with the Health District of Central Massachusetts, the Health Foundation of Central Massachusetts, where they've been sampling all those wells. And so his findings and what they found, I believe those are all publicly available now, would be good info to use in your outreach, because very similar, any testing that you have that shows those things. So yeah, and I put on here as well, you also have the BWI tool, the Be Well Informed tool. We highlight that all the time. So if you're not familiar, New Hampshire DES developed this Be Well Informed tool. It's an online tool where you can put in your sampling results, and it'll tell you if anything's over an MCL or a health risk, and it also provide ideas on the type of treatment that will effectively remediate that contaminant. And it's so popular, it's so well done, that EPA is working with ECOS, the Environmental Council of the States, to make it available to more of the country. I believe they're up to 10 different states that now have a version of this tool on ECOS website, where you can go if you're from Massachusetts or North Carolina or wherever it might be that is working on this program, and get state-specific answers to your questions related to your water quality. So I wanted to put a plug in for you there. If we could talk, I'd be glad to help out however I can. So yeah, because I've worked with your predecessor. So yeah. Okay, so quickly, I know we're running over. I apologize. That's my MO these days. Let me pull up the Google Doc, and I can't see that. I'm gonna make this bigger because I don't know what I do. That's probably big enough. Let's make it that big. Okay, so these are the questions that you all have asked so far in our question box, in our 3 of them. Okay, when I get my well water tested, does that sample go into your database? So if it's sampled by the Water Surveys lab, HEAL, Health and Environmental Applications Lab, it goes into a database here, yes. If that's your question. If anybody else samples your well, then we don't see it. If it's, PACE labs are all over the country. If you had a private lab like PACE, do your water analysis, that's your result, and they send it to you. And the fact that it's in our database doesn't mean that it's publicly available per se. It means that we can use the information to help understand what's going on in our aquifers. And so I know there's an effort to de-identify some of that data and make it available so that more people can see water quality over the rest of the country. It'd be a great thing, just because it's not trying to create a problem for any individual well owner, but it's trying to help all of us understand where we have water quality issues and we can target, like someone mentioned, targeting resources is an issue because there just aren't enough, and it makes more sense to deal with problem areas and try to provide more support in that way. So hopefully I answered your question. Can you provide links to the funding sources for private well outreach from CDC, EPA, and Extension? Yeah, could you email us? Um, the EPA program it's called their Technical Assistance and Training Grant Program, and that's not available to just anyone. There's a lot of rules behind that. We partner with RCAP because they're a national organization, and working nationally is one of the requirements for that funding. Typically, most of that funding goes to the Rural Water Association to help small communities, RCAP, which helps small communities, both water and wastewater, as well as private wells, and the environmental finance centers, which have staff all over the country also that provide resources for small water and wastewater systems and technical assistance to help them with their water and wastewater plants. And so the EPA really doesn't fund smaller projects if that's what you're after. But I can, if you call me, I can explain all that to you a little more. The CDC program, I cannot think of the name of it. Yeah, again, the last funding they did, I know, was to 19 states and like 5 counties who applied for it. And you have to be a health department. And I may have misspoke if I said Extension provides funding. Extension has their own programs for well owner education. I don't believe they actually fund others to do work. So, but I can find that if you'll email us, and I can get you that information. Are there any good classes, webinars to help me learn about water treatment? I constantly get phone calls and queries about private well owners asking for guidance on treatment systems, and I do my best based on resources like our fact sheets, be well informed, but I would love a course in more detail on treatment. I don't know if the Water Quality Association has such a course, but I know we had them and APHL do a webinar for us about treatment, and you can find that in our past webinars. The other thing I'll mention is one of the best resources I've ever come across is from Minnesota Department of Health. And if you just Google probably MDH, let me see here, let me do this real quick. MDH home water treatment. Yeah, it's the first thing that comes up. I did MDH home water treatment. That fact sheet that they've developed is really cool. I mean, I'll just pull it up. That's the last question. I'll just show you. So as you go through this, it tells you how to do things. So it suggests things like you should look for these labels. See this on the right? And if you're a well owner, especially if you're giving advice to well owners, they should never buy treatment that doesn't go through a third-party certifier, because there's no guarantee it works otherwise. You have no leg to stand on if it doesn't actually work. So at NSF, National Sanitation Foundation, Water Quality Association, their Gold Seal, or Underwriters Lab certified water quality symbol should be on any treatment device that people buy and use. But as you go through this, it gives you all these steps, and then it's got these really cool tables telling you what kind of treatment works for what kind of constituent. And so, for arsenic, absorptive media, distillation, all these things that work. And then further down, then it goes through for each of these types of media, or each of these types of treatment, the pros, cons, what it is, how it works, what it might cost, and what it's actually designed to do. And so I've highlighted this a few times on our webinars, but it's a really well done document. And Minnesota, because of they have some law that was passed a number of years ago that provides a tax where the funding all goes for environmental issues and through MDH. So they're a health department that works like almost like a research lab. They do their own studies on viruses and other things. They're able to put out these cool resources because they have the funding and the staff and the wherewithal. And so if you've not seen this, this is something that, you know, is valuable, significantly valuable in my opinion. Based on your road salt experience, how would you rate the impact of this activity? Well, I don't know if you've noticed over the last 10 or 15 years, but all the salt domes that have been built and all the changes on how it's stored and all the rules that states have made about where you can have those facilities, that's all because of increasing chlorides in shallow groundwater. So I can't find it that quick, but we've looked at data from some of the public water supplies that have shallow wells up in the Chicago area. And in some cases, we've seen the chloride levels go from 30 to 150 to 200, and they're just climbing. And so, you know, I think the taste threshold for that is around 250. Then it starts tasting a little salty. And so there's some areas where, which, you know, there's obviously aquifers that are naturally high in chloride, you know, they're saltwater aquifers. So, but this is fresh water, and it's quickly becoming a point where it's going to taste or it's going to cause corrosion problems, some of those things. And so it's, you know, it's significant impact, I'd say. They're going to have to look for alternatives, or it's not going to change because it's, you know, it's the nature of the way they're deposited, and a lot of streets that aren't sewered, you know, don't have storm sewers, where all that's going right in the groundwater. And actually, storm sewers don't even matter because the reality is most storm sewers leak like a sieve, right? We see a lot of communities in Illinois where we've looked at the amount of water they pump, groundwater pumpage, for their water supply, and then their wastewater treatment, and they're treating 3 to 4 times the amount of wastewater because there's so much leakage in all their sewer systems and stuff. So, you know, it's because of a high water table in that case. But I don't know, as far as rating it, we have someone here, Walt Kelly, who's the head of our groundwater section, who's actually done some of this research, and he's actually the best person to answer this question. If you want to email me, I can forward it to him, and he can give you a lot better answer than I can. But it's certainly a problem. So, and I wish I could pull up that. There's a really great graphic that shows like 6 communities in the Chicago area, and their chloride levels over from like the 60s till today, or until like 2010, and it's they're increasing a lot. It's getting, if it's shallow groundwater, it's a problem. All right. For those of you that stuck around, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And hopefully this helped you today. If you have any questions, I provided my email address earlier, but you can also email us at info@privatewellclass.org. Those actually go directly to Katie, but she can forward them to me. And yeah, thank you.